Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. I have a birthday coming up soon, and I've been thinking about both my life and the times in which I've lived. I was born just days after Black Tuesday, the day of the most devastating stock market crash in U.S. history. It was not until my 25th birthday in 1954 that the stock market would again reach its peak level from 1929. Naturally, I don't remember the crash, but I do remember growing up in a time that everyone called the Depression. I grew up keenly aware that the adults didn't think there was enough money or jobs to go around. I remember hobos, as they were called, coming around to the back door and asking my mother for a meal. Those were the days of soup lines in shanty towns in America. The 30s saw a terrible drought in the Midwest that resulted in the worst ecological disaster in American history. The tearing away of topsoil from the earth in the area known as the Dust Bowl. Those were hard times. I didn't realize just how rough they were until later. Then we went from an economic disaster into a major war, and not just any war, but the biggest, deadliest conflict in human history, World War II. Over 60 million died in that one war. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb exploded in a small tower over the sands of New Mexico. A few days later, on August 6th, America dropped a similar bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, and the world entered the nuclear age. 4 years later, the Soviet Union test-fired a nuclear device, and the Cold War began in earnest. In the effort to contain communism, Americans were soon fighting in Korea. One of those Americans was me. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War, the counterculture rebellion of the late 60s and early 70s. I remember the Arab oil embargo, Watergate, the Nixon resignation. I remember the malaise of Jimmy Carter and the terror of 9/11. But through all of that, the American people seemed never to lose their sense of optimism. That is, until now. In a recent nationwide Fox News poll, Americans were asked, which better describes how you feel about the way things are going in the world these days? 7% said they didn't know. 35% chose everything will be all right. And a staggering 58% thought that the way things are going could be best described by the phrase, things are going to hell in a handbasket. Americans today share a sense of doom that they just can't seem to shake. So what makes our time different? The Ebola outbreak? My heart goes out to the people of West Africa, and I hope we're able to help them. But why are Americans so afraid? One person has died of Ebola on American soil, and 2 others are known to have contracted the virus here. For contrast, think about this. An average of 1,500 Americans a day die from cancer. ISIS is unsettling, but does it really compare to the communist regimes of the 20th century and potential harm? What about Russia? Vladimir Putin has been doing some extreme saber rattling recently. The Western sanctions are beginning to bite. Even worse for Russia's petroleum-based economy, oil prices have been falling like a rock. Putin has been lashing out, trying to remind the world that Russia is not, as President Obama once called it, just a regional power. On October 14th, Putin said, Russia's partners should remember the risks involved in disputes between nuclear powers. You can't get much more blatant than that. When ISIS threatens to fly their death flag over the White House, it doesn't mean much because they're a long way from being able to carry out such a threat. But when Putin threatens to nuke us, we have to pay attention because he has the ability and the nuclear arsenal to carry out his threats. And frankly, he seems just about crazy enough to do it. Putin is one of the dozens of existential threats facing America, but I don't really think that's why Americans are feeling a sense of doom. Deep down, the citizens know that a nation's true strength is in her morality, and they sense that America's moral base is crumbling. Consequently, they feel footsteps on their graves. This is a strategic time for Christians to be telling the world what the Bible says about our time and about the hope it gives. Later in the program, I'll tell you about the power and courage God has promised us as we finish these critical moments at the end of our age. A few weeks ago, I talked about Psalm 127, verse 1, and how it applies to the United States today. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. I gave several examples of how America's watchmen have stayed awake in vain. I want to briefly return to that theme. I've titled this segment, Godlessness Equals Futility. But I could also have called it, There's a Hole in Our Boat. That's what Psalm 127:1 feels like in practice. You bail and bail, but the water inside the boat only gets deeper. Things don't work right. You work harder, but get less done. You stay on the job for more hours, but bring home less pay. Things go wrong that should have gone right. That's the USA in 2014. The cost of keeping us safe is going through the roof. When we do a bombing run in Iraq or Syria, it costs a fortune. According to Stars and Stripes, each U.S. strike against the self-proclaimed Islamic State can involve several aircraft and munitions and cost up to $500,000. The headline of their story told the tale. Destroying a $30,000 Islamic State pickup truck can cost the U.S. $500,000. Fighting a politically correct war can be expensive beyond all reason. Last July, Secretary of State John Kerry was caught on an open mic making sarcastic remarks about Israel and its efforts to conduct pinpoint operations in bombing Hamas. The Israelis couldn't afford to use only smart bombs, and we can't afford to either. Sometimes you have to drop dumb bombs. Sometimes you have to hit the enemy with a blunt object. It cost us $500,000 to blow up an old ISIS Toyota because our boat has a hole in it. America's Center for Disease Control and Prevention once meant the best in the world. Not anymore. Our boat seems to have sprung a leak. With the panic over Ebola, both Congress and the administration are going to work hard to convince us, the public, that they are on top of the situation. Sadly, they don't know how to do that with competence or creativity. So get ready to see big money rolling into the fight to keep Americans safe from Ebola, even though at this point we don't know how much of a threat it actually is. Political leaders will do what they know how to do, and that is to throw money, our money, at the problem. The CDC's annual budget is already $11.3 billion. That's billion with a B dollars. They've known about this Ebola outbreak since early in the year. Yet even with their enormous budget, they were totally unprepared for anything to happen in the United States homeland. Why? Because our boat has a hole in it. We're trying to succeed without God. The U.S. bought 20 Italian-made transport planes for Afghanistan's military. So far, 16 of the 20 have been sold for scrap. Those planes cost the United States over $500 million. The Afghanis sold them at about 6 cents a pound. Why do things like this happen? Because unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain who build it. Psalms 33 points to our one true hope in the time of trouble. It says, "The king is not saved by a mighty army. A warrior is not delivered by a great strength. A horse is false hope for victory, nor does it deliver anyone by its great strength. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope for his loving kindness, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine." Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. Near the end of his life, David had a son, Solomon, brought before him, and he gave Solomon the charge to build the temple. His statement contained an inspired prayer, a great prayer for any father over his children. "The Lord be with you," he said, "that you may be successful." That's my prayer for you, and it's my prayer for America. As individuals and as a nation, we have the ability to reject the presence and fellowship of the Lord, but we do not have the ability to achieve real and lasting success without him.